Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Shadows and Ink podcast. Today we are talking vampires, and
Woohoo!
our guest is Brad Ricks, who has written the Night Crew books. And I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself. Take it away.
It is a pleasure to be on. Yes, My name's Brad Ricks. I have two books out that are all about vampires for the most part. It's Night Crew and the Night Crew 2 Bloodlust, as well as I also have a podcast called the Night Crew Podcast. And I actually started with a series on vampires because that's what the books were about. So I did a deep dive on vampires and a lot of different aspects on vampires, and so I had a lot of fun with it. Then finally decided, this is becoming just a vampire podcast. I might want to switch it up and do some other monsters occasionally. So uh, I've shifted gears a little bit, but yeah, I did a good number of episodes all about vampires.
Okay, great. So, what is it about vampires that appeals to you and inspires you? What makes them special?
So it's really a couple of different things. Um, for me, vampires kind of were always the creature that kind of had that like ultimate control, both of themselves and others. You look at creatures like zombies and werewolves, and to me, they never seemed like they really had agency. It was you think to a lot of the werewolf movies, like American Werewolf in London or Monster Squad or Wolfman. At the end, the Wolfman he's like tortured. He doesn't want to be a killer, and he's relieved when the end comes. Vampires were always different. It's um they liked what they were and so they kind of had that control of themselves. And then we've as kind of a society, we've turned vampires into so many things. They represent everything from sex to addiction to eternal youth. They're everything that we're kind of scared of and secretly wish we could be. Immortal, sexy, mysterious, own a castle. And so that to me is really a lot of the appeal when it comes to vampires.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on that because when vampires started out, yeah, they were very much more in control than, say, werewolves, who were kind of at the whim of the moon.
Hmm.
But yeah, vampires have kind of evolved to get a little more angsty, though, and a little more tragic, which is interesting. They've sort of taken on some of those other monster characteristics.
There are those, and looking at some of the question stuff you said, later on we can definitely get into talking about. There are those that nowadays we have there's some, and like some of the different series that we've movie TV series and stuff that they definitely get
Angel
into
comes to
some.
mind immediately.
Yes, Angel, Spike has his little issues, Stefan and Damon, the Vampire Diaries, so yeah, you get those that start becoming their own like tortured self. And but you look at going back to, if we went back to like Dracula, or the early, all the way up through like the Hammer films and stuff like that, it is very much like the the vampire's like, hey, I'm a killer, that's what I do, and I enjoy doing it.
Yeah, he was definitely the bad guy in the old films.
Yep.
So, yeah, well, as we were just discussing there, vampire mythology and lore has expanded from the folklore origins, and it's incorporated aspects from Hollywood, books, other sources. So, in your opinion, which of these additions do you think enhance the genre, and which are maybe a little more optional or maybe even hurted?
So I think some of the best like enhancements to the genre are the ones that to me really kind of drag the vampires kind of back towards the shadows. That where they're not the love interest kind of stuff. It is the ones where they are the killers. It kind of brings it back to the more traditional origins, especially when you get into some of the more Slavic or Eastern European kind of folklore of vampires. That's to me where the vampires really have teeth. Not to make a pun, but um, so it's those elements that from a the enhancement piece. I go back even like most recently the movies like Sinners. I thought was a great example of really taking vampires back to that. Hey, we're just here to kill people kind of kind of tradition. And so I, you look at that kind of stuff. To me, that's where a lot of the, the good enhancement or the, um, where some of the, some of the things kind of needs to drive. Now, some of the more optional, so to say, as I put little finger quotes up, um, to me, it's Hollywood's like kind of glamorization of the vampire. I mean, it's entertaining, but to me, it's more like a dessert than the meal. Um, you know, it it's stuff like the perfect romances or the sparkling skin. We know what we're talking about there.
Mhm.
Vegan vampires and stuff like that. I mean, they're fun, but they don't really define the myth. It's the root of the vampire myth. To me, it's that stuff that's like it's hunger, it's the curse, it's tragedy. That is that part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I've always liked Supernatural's take on the vampires was interesting as well. So that
I
they were
agree.
definitely the villains.
Yes.
But I like the way that they were so hard. They were a little harder to kill in that particular show than like say in Hollywood where you just shove them out the door at dawn.
Well, and that's one thing, like, I kinda switched up a little bit in my night crew books in that sunlight doesn't kill kill them because I went back to, like, Dracula, and
Mm,
sunlight didn't kill Dracula. That was something that Hollywood created in, like, the silent Nosferatu. They needed a way to
mm.
kill him, and they were like, what if we just pull the curtain down?" And so, that's kinda where that originated. It wasn't in some of the original books. And so whenever I started with the night crew, I went back to Dracula and said I want to start here, and from my kind of world building mythos in regards to vampires. um I also hate it in some of those movies where they have a stake and they just like barely touch them in the chest and it's like poof, vampire explodes. I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Those get kind of annoying.
Yeah, from my own research, it's pretty hard to shove a wooden stake through someone's chest.
I actually make I poke fun of that in the Night Crew books. The main character when he's kind of learning, um, he keeps wanting to go for a stake through the heart because I say you could do a stake through the heart or you can cut their head off, and um, as he's in training, he the person he's training they have like little dummy sticks and stuff, and he's like boom, got you in the chest. He was like, yeah, heart is over on the other side. You would have missed. It was like, neck, big target, heart, small target. It's like, go for the big target.
Yeah,
Because
not to mention
yes,
you have to get through the ribs to get to the heart.
yeah, it's not an easy task. It's,
Yeah.
if
See,
if
that's
you,
why all those original ones had a mallet to go with
I
the
was
stake.
just about to say that. If you think of like the original movies and stuff, they have a stake and then they have a big huge hammer that they're backing on top of it. Because yeah, it's not so easy just to just gently stab and
Yeah.
you're like, ooh, gotcha. It's like,
Yeah, well, that comes from the original folklores because they used to stake them, but they stuck they staked the bodies in the grave and they hammered the stake in.
correct. Yeah, they wanted to make sure that it was more so it wasn't so much as, wanting to make sure that you pierce the heart and all that kind of stuff, as much as you want to make sure that this person cannot get up. And so, yeah, you were literally nailing them into the coffin.
Yeah. Okay, and that's an excellent segue into the next question, which is what kind of vampire myth and folklore have you delved into in your research?
Well, so like I said, a lot of it was like before I started reading or writing the Night Crew, I went and reread Dracula, and I kind of pulled a lot of stuff from the kind of the original, novel of Dracula. I wanted to kind of give myself a starting spot, and so that's kind of where it was. All across the globe, there are so many different kinds of vampires that are out there, and each mythos is a little different, and what it can do, and how you kill them, and so I was like, okay, I'm gonna kind of stick with this, and this is what I'm gonna kind of use as my baseline. So I guess in that instance, it's a lot of East European, Russian, Slavic, because that's where Bram Stoker pulled a lot of his stuff. Um, an example of that is things like in Dracula, I use a sunlight example. Sunlight didn't kill him, didn't kill Dracula. He didn't like it very much and rather slept during the day. But it didn't kill him. He could walk around during the day. So mine can as well, and same kind of thing. They don't. I describe it for them as sunlight is kind of a weight that kind of bears down on them. So they're kind of weaker, but they're still deadly.
Okay, so that's excellent. Another excellent segue into the next question, which is how are you building your vampiric lore for the Night Crew books? You've mentioned that you're pulling in the Dracula myths, and that you're mixing it up a little bit. So how are you
A little bit.
mixing it up with new ideas? And do you plan to pull in any non European folklore?
Um, I don't have a necessarily a plan to pull in on the European folklore. I mean, I might as, kind of as the story needs, I might, but
Yeah,
um well,
never say
well
never.
yeah, never say never. I mean, it's yeah. Um so for the most part, I'm trying to stick as kind of true to form as I can, with maybe a little touch of flair here and there. I know one thing that I have in the Night Crew, there's a strong emphasis on blood and bloodlines. I mean, the second book is called Bloodlust. So I added this kind of like element where if a vampire, if he has drank from you, it's possible to do like a, I'm going to say this because I watched Star Trek last night, but almost like a Vulcan mind meld kind of thing. Um, in the in the first book actually, so there's a scene where Thomas has to feed on Mike to get his strength back, then afterward Thomas is able to show Mike what happened when they kind of got ambushed, by doing that kind of like, he was like, here, let me show you, and like kind of touch his head, and again you kind of get that little Vulcan mind meld kind of thing going. And it really just because I am putting a lot of emphasis on things like, the blood and bloodlines and that, and so I'm using like that to me, from what the way I'm describing it in the book, that blood is kind of the strongest tie that binds kind of thing. And so it allows that kind of connection to happen. So that's a little bit of an expansion from just the typical kind of, you know vampire power. Um, but it is what I kind of added just to add a little flair.
Okay, so what do you think are the most overused aspects of vampire myths in books and TV and whatever? And what vampire folklore is underused?
So overused, to me, it's that polished, glamorous vampire who looks like they stepped out of a perfume ad. It's
Mm.
I think sometimes the genre can kind of lean a little too often on the brooding. Um, I love Anne Rice to death, but I think she kind of was the cause of a lot of that, in Interview with the Vampire. Um, and then I think we've also kind of squeezed that whole like forbidden romance angle. I think we've kind of squeezed that little lemon dry. And so from an overused, those kind of things. Again, on the last part of that, it's very much that Twilight and Vampire Diaries, and I mean that whole forbidden romance thing was kind of that, like what those were all like wrapped around almost. Um, from an underused standpoint, there there really is some really cool folkloric kind of versions out there. I mean, going back to some of the more corpse-like and bloated, the disease carriers, spirit-based vampires, and but then there are some like wickedly scary kind of regional variations. When I did some research for one of the podcasts where I talk about how to kill vampires around the world, I really got into all the different kinds of vampires around the world. And I mean, there are some that they feed on life energy, others on like emotions and things like that. There's this one in the Philippines called the Manananggal. I know I butchered that name again, and I do it every time. Um, but she's a woman by day, and at night, like she sprouts wings and detaches from her lower body, and then flies around looking for pregnant women to suck the hearts out of their fetuses. I mean, that is like some terrifying creativity stuff there, which what
Mm.
I think would make for some awesome kind of rich storytelling if, people jumped into, some of the other kind of again like those versions and variations that are out there.
Oh yeah, and a lot of the Philippine mythology has got some weird creatures in it. It is just rich for horror stuff, I tell you.
Well, and that is one thing I give Guillermo del Toro credit for when he did The Strain, because it does take a different take on some of the vampire mythos, with it being um it was, that worm, and it was almost like it very much was like a disease almost. And the main character was an epidemiologist, and he's worked for the CDC and all that. And so there they did take a in the strain, it does take a different take on that vampire legend. And um I mean, it kind of got into some other stuff as well, but I thought that was a I did enjoy their kind of different variation on it, because it wasn't just the typical kind of vampire.
Yeah, variations are always fun when you're doing it with vampires.
Hmm.
So, why do you think readers find vampires appealing? Do you think it's the tragic gothic aspects or the transcendence of death, or is it something else?
um to me, I think it's that they're constantly changing with the times and society. Up until the 50s or 60s, I'd say it was more that kind of gothic nature combined with some underlining sexual innuendos, that were present in the vampire myth. You look at the Hammer films and Christopher Lee. Yeah, he's all brooding, but he's just like brooding with like sexual energy without really even needing to say a single line. I think there was a one or two of the Hammer films where he didn't even say a word. He just showed up, kind of hissed a little bit, and bit people's necks, and but it worked. Um, and then as we get into the 70s and 80s, we've lost the castle. In Fright Night, he moved into, the vampire moved in next door. And in Lost Boys, they were Santa Clara, California. It was, vampires, but it was rock and roll and teenage rebellion. And, so it's just the myth kept changing with the times. We get into the 90s and 2000s, and that's kind of what now we bring in kind of that romance, and you get Anne Rice and Louis and Lestat and New Orleans, and that immortality is a curse kind of thing. Um, it's also, we get vampires as love interest. That's the Buffy and Twilight and Vampire Diaries. And so I think a lot of what kind of keeps people engaged and appeal is that, as we kind of move along with society, vampires kind of shift and change with us, which keeps it interesting. It keeps it relevant. And it's not every movie is set in the 1800s and is always in a European country somewhere, and there's no relevance to what's to today.
Yeah, because I mean, you look at the even just Dracula adaptations, they have gone from the classic horror to the more gothic sort of spectacular thing with Gary Oldman.
Mhm.
I forget what the who the director of that was. Um, and then you've got some like in the 70s, you had Dracula as a comedy, and you had
Mhm.
the Blackula,
Mhm.
um,
Yep.
and then you go into the more modern romantic movies like Twilight and stuff. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, vampires are very adaptable, more so than other monsters, probably.
Oh,
Because I
I
mean,
agree.
you've had some adaptations with werewolves and zombies, but it's like maybe only one or two adaptations, and vampires have just been doing their thing.
I think I described it once on my podcast as like the Swiss Army knife of monsters. I mean, they can kind of be anything and everything.
Okay, so do you think the idea of vampires, though, reflects the outcasts of society and therefore can be used as a metaphor for certain aspects of humanity, a societal mirror, if you will?
So vampires are kind of tailor made for metaphor. They kind of stand just outside humanity, kind of close enough to resemble us, but far enough to kind of expose what we're uncomfortable with. Um, it's the person who doesn't fit in or who kind of lives with a secret, but they also kind of have those darker impulses. It's hunger, obsession, power, mortality. So they definitely there is a societal mirror kind of kind of functionality there. Um, a lot of that's probably why they've survived in storytelling for so long, because they do have that kind of juxtaposition with those there's the societal norms, and they're just kind of right on the outside of it. And again, it's kind of that, I think I said it earlier, it's the everything we're kind of scared of, but sometimes secretly want. And so there's that kind of tension between, you know, the we we want the power and we want the immortality, but at the same time, no, we don't. And
Mm,
so there's that kind of conflict. And I think that's where, a lot of, the vampires is kind of a metaphor. I think it's definitely where they sit. A lot of the early you take a lot of the early vampire myths, and it really came from a lot of fear and metaphor and stuff. And it was, the you know it, when you saw the disease ridden body, and people are like, oh my god, it's a vampire. When really it was just, they didn't understand decomposition and stuff like that. And so it the vampire self kind of become, kind of almost came out of metaphor to be what it is.
yeah, yeah, and back in the origins of the vampire myth, I mean, they didn't understand how disease worked either, so they needed an explanation as to why all these people were dying or
Right.
getting sick. So yeah, oh, it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, there's a dead spirit causing this.
Right. Yeah. Why are people all dying of the same disease? Hello,
Mm,
tuberculosis. And it was, they didn't understand it was disease spreading. That was like, oh, it must be, there is this one evil spirit that is spreading itself amongst, the village, or, because yeah, they didn't understand how
yeah,
viruses work and spread from person to person.
yeah, and if the outbreak stopped after they staked a body, well, then that was the vampire. So
Exactly. Yep. It's like, ooh, found the problem. Yeah.
yeah.
Which, and there are some real life examples back from the late 1800s, where it was like the judge ordered the body to be exhumed so that they could do that. It was like
Mm,
that actually made it through court cases. It was like, yeah, we think Bob is getting out of his grave at night and killing people. Do you mind if we go ahead and dig him up and then stake him down to his coffin and put him back? And the judge is like, yep, sounds good to me. Poof.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it went beyond the 1800s too, a little bit. I think there's some recorded cases even as far as the 1920s or even further, I think. It's been a while since I've done my vampire research, so
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean,
yeah.
especially in some of the Romanian countries and things
Mm.
that are very, very steeped in tradition and lore.
Yeah, well, even New England had a vampire scare back in the day, 1800s, 1700s, something like that.
Right.
So, as we were talking, the classic idea of vampires is very gothic, brooding, mysterious guy in a castle. Um, but modern interpretations have changed the view of vampires. So, how do you think that has affected the vampires? How do you think we've moved away from that gothic idea?
Um. So the Gothic vampire, I mean, it's still very iconic. When if you say Dracula, you immediately have the image in your head of the castle and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So the Gothic imagery is still very iconic, but kind of like we talked about earlier, modern stories have kind of pushed them into new environments and new, almost emotional territory. Instead of the nobles in a crumbling castle, we see vampires navigating modern society and technology and relationships and moral gray areas, and that kind of stuff. um some versions lean into humor, others into action or psychological horror. But the shift has really kind of been basically kind of less aristocratic gloom and kind of more human complexity.
Yeah, I mean, because there's been TV shows where vampires have been detectives, private detectives, uh,
Yep.
running cafes. The Being Human in the UK, that was that they had an episode where they were taking care of a cafe, which was hysterical. Werewolf and a
Well,
vampire trying to sell coffee and donuts, or whatever they were selling. I forget.
Well, if you think of the movie, Abigail, I mean, the majority of the movie, I mean, it's all the people that are trapped in the house and all that. But at the end, when her dad shows up, and it all was, he has this huge empire of, that's doing more than just killing people. He has this huge empire, and the people who he's been killing, they like wronged him, and so uh, it's and so it kind of goes beyond just the normal, like, oh, we're just going to, he has his whole he has a whole empire of stuff that he does, and a business empire. And so it's definitely stretched beyond the normal, you know yes, I'm a count
Mhm, yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, but that is a bit of a trope with vampires that they all have money, which kind of makes sense. If you're immortal, one would hope you'd know how to invest.
I saw a joke once that said, if you've been around for 300 years and you're still broke, just walk out in the sun.
Yeah.
It's just go hang out at the beach. It's time.
Yeah, but it'd be interesting though that the vampire, has all these investments, lost all of it in the 1930s stock market crash, and then and then just sort of hoards his money under his mattress or something after that.
Right. I feel like there needs to be there's a story brooding somewhere for poor broke vampires that are just kind of hanging out like we don't know what to do.
So, and vampires have always had a bit of an erotic air to them, um, but why do you think in recent years they have evolved from the villain to the romantic hero or anti-hero?
Uh, so they definitely have always had kind of a little erotic undertone. I kind of talked earlier about you get into the Hammer films, and Christopher Lee just kind of just ooze that kind of sexual tension and stuff on the screen. I mean, a lot of it you're kind of literally leaning close to the neck and crossing boundaries and that kind of stuff. So it definitely have always there's always been that kind of erotic undertone to it. I mean, even go back to the book Dracula, and the how he was like, you know, as a fog or as a mist coming into I think it was Mina. I always get the two the backwards, but when he's coming into her room at night, and so it definitely always has had that. But I, I think a lot of it, the writers have kind of started to explore that more, uh, kind of explore different areas. Um, again, we talked about Anne Rice. She kind of gave us the vampire. We were able to kind of dive into the vampire's thoughts, their guilt. Louis was very much a kind of a brooding hero that we were, somewhat rooting for, but at the same time, we were also rooting for Lestat. um, but then when you get into shows like Buffy, they give us the vampires that were trying to be better. Spike was one who he kind of kept wavering back and forth between we didn't like Spike and he was a bad guy, but then he was kind of like the anti-hero at times. And the more that vampires, I think, has kind of moved out of the more they kind of have moved out of like the one-off book kind of standpoint and in more of to like a series. I think television series has really allowed us to kind of see the entire arc of the entire character arcs of things. So you get from Buffy, or you get Twilight, or True Blood, or Vampire Diaries, where the vampire isn't, it's not necessarily just a threat. They're love interest. They become the tragic hero. They're suddenly somebody you're rooting for. So I think they kind of have evolved as their storylines have evolved, kind of moving them from that villainy aspect over to more of a complex, compelling character.
And it's interesting though that you mentioned the series aspect of it because you need more than just a like a cartoon caricature villain.
Right.
I mean, Dracula is not, but I mean, some of the early horror films, of course, by the nature of their sort of smaller budgets, the villain is kind of a little one note.
Right.
But you need more of a complex character when you're doing a series. So that's an interesting idea as to why they sort of moved more towards the hero aspect of it.
Yeah, I think like I said, as the kind of as again, there as the stories have evolved, and as just from a television series, and how those kind of develop and grow, you get that you definitely get you have to expand out those characters, and you give them more depth, unless it is like just a one-off, the what they used to call it in Star Trek, the red shirts or whatever, that
Mm.
you're just planning just to kill real quick. if it is a major character, you know, nowadays, you want to give your antagonist a backstory, and the more you rationalize what your antagonist is doing, the more you see that there is that emotional complexity in your bad guy. And then, the longer that storyline goes, the more as an audience you can sometimes start to um eh, kind of connect with those storylines.
I think that's one thing that Buffy did well, though, is because the show made the vampires sort of a dual personality. Like, they
Hmm.
were sort of possessed by the vampire demon, whatever it was. They didn't really ever define that particularly well, but, I mean, it's like it was a demon creature,
Hmm.
so yeah. So that sort of was interesting that they could regain their soul and be one step closer to being human again, so yeah.
Right.
So, well, how do you think gender differences have been portrayed when it comes to vampires? Do you think that certain gender stereotypes have influenced the way female vampires have been written as opposed to male vampires?
Uh, Definitely. So I love this question whenever I saw it, and so I was like, "Ooh, I'm gonna get examples and all kind of good stuff for this one," because this is seeing how kind of the archetype has changed over the years is very interesting. Gender has really always played a huge role in how vampires are portrayed, and historically, it's been really really stark of a very stark difference. Um, Early fiction tended to cast male vampires as predatory aristocratic figures. Think Dracula. That's kind of he was kind of the stereotype. And then female vampires were often framed around seduction and corruption and tragic beauty. um, Both are very strong stereotypes, but in kind of very different ways. Male vampires were traditionally embodied dominance and control. Again, I kind of harken back to Dracula. Look at it was powerful and commanding and aristocratic. Even before him, John Palladori's the vampire, same kind of thing. That he was, which was kind of the blueprint for Dracula actually. Um, but later male vampires even kind of continued that. So Lestat, an interview with the vampire, is that same kind of character. Angel and Spike and Buffy, Stefan and Damon in Vampire Diaries. There's that they are that kind of very commanding, person. Um, Even when they're kind of conflicted, they're really still framed as dangerous and powerful forces who drive the story through action and moral struggle. Um, Female vampires has always kind of been more like they looked at on the kind of sexual fear and taboo standpoint. Um, they were always kind of more portrayed as it's kind of seductive women who preyed on weak men and children and that kind of stuff. Very much sexual, or social anxieties around, kind of female sexuality. Look at the bride vampires in Dracula. That they're tempting Harker, and so it's that they're just there to kind of be beautiful, alluring, but they don't have much agency. Um, but that's all kind of changed here in the last 20, 30-ish years. Um, I mean, True Blood has some really good, strong female characters. Jessica and Pam, they're not just seductress, they're powerful and morally complicated as well. In like Underworld, for instance. So Selena, you know, she's not a seductress. She's a skilled warrior.
Mm,
And she's carrying the whole narrative on her shoulders, really. It's her. It's not a female vampire who's trying to use her feminine wiles to seduce people. No, she's out there you know using her strength rather than sexuality.
yeah,
um
she'll shoot you first.
exactly. Yeah, and then there's definitely been some good progress towards kind of getting rid of that. I mean, there is still some of that kind of stereotype stuff that lingers out there, with some of the female vampires. They're kind of more likely to be more emotional or sensual. Males kind of tend to be on the brooding anti-hero, kind of wrestling with morality, think, Blade and that kind of stuff, um but the it definitely has kind of definitely evolved over the years. Um, and I think really it's really helped to kind of make the vampire genre more richer and kind of stranger and a lot more fun.
Yeah, well, there's an idea. Make a brooding female vampire conflicted.
That is actually some of them on like I think it's Pam is the one who's like that on True Blood. It's been a little while since I watched that series, but I want to say it's Pam is the one who's, she is kind of that like, she's very closed off emotionally, and she doesn't want to really get involved.
Mm. Okay, so of course Dracula is the most influential vampire book that's out there. So, but what are some of the other vampire books that you think have influenced the genre?
um, well, even before Dracula, there was I said John Palladori's The Vampire, because it was kind of the blueprint that Stoker used. Palladori is Lord Ruthven, um, was kind of that first aristocratic, kind of charming vampire, which he based that on Lord Byron, and the Dracula kind of came from it. Uh, More modern, I mean, Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, I mean, Louis and Lestat were very influential in a lot of what we see and do from the vampire stuff today. I mean, you could say that was the precursor to the Twilights and the some of the stuff that happened in Buffy or the Vampire Diaries. If there's not Anne Rice, I don't think there's the others. And so I think that's very influential. Um, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention Salem's Lot, because that really brought vampires into small town America, and I mean, it kind of took over a whole town. So it definitely helped to make vampires terrifying again. Stephen King, he blended a good bit of classic folklore with some modern dread, and it definitely, I mean, it was an influence for me and a lot of other writers. Um,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
I've heard that one come up before. This Salem's Lot, yeah.
yeah, Salem's Lot was a great. I mean, it's a great vampire novel. And so Stephen King doesn't. He's one that doesn't delve into kind of your classic monsters very often. But when he does, I mean, he does a good job. I mean, Cycle of the Werewolf was a great werewolf novel. Salem's Lot is a great vampire novel. So when he does, he really kind of knocks it out of the park. But yeah, for the most part, he doesn't dive too much into a lot of the kind of your classic monsters. But
Mm.
and then from the other, I mean, other novels you get, I think it was the uh well, I mean, the Vampire Diaries was a book series before it was a TV, but that gets you into all the romantic supernatural kind of stuff. Um, but so from an influential standpoint, definitely the Anne Rice novels, the Vampire Chronicles, Salem's Lot, and then Twilight. Um, I on my podcast I give Twilight crap a lot, but I also say it made a bajillion dollars, so it can take it. Um, so it did open up like a whole new generation of readers into things like reading about vampires and werewolves and stuff. So yes, they were very milk toast and they sparkled like disco balls, but at the same time, like I said, it anything that can kind of help bring readers kind of, even if it's horror adjacent kind of genre, then hey, I guess I can't give her too much crap.
I think Twilight also inspired a lot of writers to go back to making vampires villains too. 'Cause I've
That is
seen a
true.
lot of that. It's like, yeah, we want the vampires back in the evil realm.
I always joke that one of the reasons I started writing the Night Crew, I went to the bookstore and I was looking I wanted to read a vampire novel, and I went and I was like, why is every stupid vampire novel in the erotic section? It should not be that way. And so I was like, well, I'm gonna write one then. And so that's when I kind of started mapping out the Night Crew. Then it turned into a lot bigger thing than I thought it was going to be.
Okay, so vampires, as you said, are a staple of horror. but they have popped up, as we've been discussing, in fantasy, romance, mystery, and they've even popped up in sci-fi. So
Hmm.
why do you think they have such a cross-genre appeal?
Um, Again, it's kind of like what we talked about. They're very malleable and flexible. They adaptable. As we said, they're one of the few monsters that can kind of shift tones without losing their core identity. Um, at the heart, vampires are about power and desire and fear and transformation, and those kind of fit anywhere. And a lot of genres are kind of based on that. You take horror. Well, they're the predators. They're tapping into death and disease and all that kind of stuff. And romance, it's forbidden desire and dangerous attraction and all those kind of things. In fantasy, you get powerful immortal beings, and and you throw a little bit of politics in, and that's world building right there for fantasy novels. And mystery, you get the hidden identities and long histories that create this kind of just natural intrigue to them. And then sci-fi, you can kind of reinterpret vampirism however. It can be an alien condition, it can be mutation. I'm thinking of things like I Am Legend and Daybreakers, and so yeah, you can. I think there's very few creatures that really can kind of slide between those so easily. A werewolf or zombie kind of usually brings they kind of have like one tone with them, but a vampire can be terrifying or seductive or philosophical or comedic, or and it's but you still recognize them as a vampire.
Mm.
um I think it's why they survive kind of every cultural shift that we've kind of thrown at them.
Yeah, definitely, and, they fit nicely into urban fantasy too, because I mean, they're an excellent metaphor for that sort of night stalker, sort of even serial killer vibe that you can
Hmm.
get in the city, so, yeah. So
Yeah,
they
like
do
I said,
fit it.
they kind of fit everywhere, and really it all comes down to, like I said, that kind of initial, that power, desire, fear. Just there's so much that there's so much kind of core tenets to kind of the vampire mythos that can just be picked up and dropped into almost any genre, and you're still good to go.
Yeah. So, what is your favorite medium for depicting vampires? Books, TV, or movies? And what unique qualities does each medium bring to the genre?
So I, I'm I'll start by saying books are my favorite because I mean I'm a writer, so it has to be books are my favorite. But I mean all three are great, but for like different reasons. Books really let you get inside the vampire's head. No other medium allows you to have that inner thought. And it's really one thing that sets books apart, no matter what you're talking about. Books are always great because you get so much deeper emotional connection with a character in a book than you do really anywhere else. You get that interior perspective, that you really it's hard to capture that visually. If you put every if you put everything that Anne Rice had in Interview with the Vampire on the screen, then audiences would fall asleep because so much of it is like is like all interior of what's happening. I mean, that's part of why it translated so just I know there was the movie that came out years ago with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise and all that, but was it Netflix or whatever or whoever's redoing it, or HBO that's redoing the series, and it turns into a series real easy because there is so much in there. Um, and so it's a books kind of definitely have that where you can dive into it so deep into the characters. Um, but like TV also kind of brings its own kind of element that kind of we talked about, where you're able to have that kind of slow burn character development. You can hate Spike and then kind of not hate Spike to where he's one of your favorite characters, and so you you have that length of time to really explore that entire character arc. In books, that's you're talking a 7, 10, 12 book series before you get close to that kind of, unless you're just cramming a whole bunch in, before you get that kind of, um, development of characters that are happening. So TV kind of gives you that, in those long form series like that. Um, but then movies kind of also they give you that, the spectacle, the you get that visual impact, the shadows, the fangs, the blood, the you know 30 Days of Night and Lost Boys, and show you how terrifying and intimate a vampire can be. So you get that kind of quick little punch you in the gut kind of thing. So each has its, to me, has its element that kind of works for it. And again, I go back to books are my favorite, but
Mm,
like I said, every medium has its different, has its different place for what it kind of brings. Has its own strengths. So books from the psychological deep in depth. TV gives you the good character arc and world building, and movies give you that atmosphere and that, to me, like I said, that visual kind of punch you in the face real quick.
I do think TVs and movie do add one more thing, and that's the actors' portrayals,
Hmm.
because they can often give characters just that interesting little twist that you don't get in the book. But I agree, though, you do get a lot more depth in books than you do in TV and
Well,
movies.
and yeah, and like in TV and movies, like a lot of times when you're reading, there are certain things, especially if the author doesn't specifically say, you know, and then he shrugged his shoulders or raised an eyebrow or something like that. From watching on TV, you sometimes can get some of that little what's happening behind the scenes just by, depending on how good an actor is, in just their facial expressions can show you a little behind the scenes that, kind of what you get from a book, without necessarily having to say the words, assuming the actor does a good job of kind of portraying that.
Mm. And so our next question is, what are some of your favorite vampire depictions in books and or on screen?
So books, again, it's definitely the classic, Dracula. Again, huge fan of Salem's Lot. Um, I did read the Vampire Chronicles, so um, so yes, although I, hate that they kind of set up for things like Twilight and all that, but they were definitely a good enjoyable read. So I loved the Vampire Chronicles. Um, Movie wise, I'm definitely more of I love the Lost Boys, 30 Days of Night, um, and even most recently, I said, Sinners. I loved how it mixed a lot of, the vampire stuff with, it had that Delta blues kind of, the music and the storyline to it, and it almost played like a musical almost, and in how they kind of intermix some of that together. And I'm a big blues fan, so having that as kind of like a background, or the soundtrack to it, um, I love that take on it.
Okay, so what's your next project and what's coming up for you? You have any book secrets you can share with us?
So right now, a couple things I'm doing right now. I am so Night Crew 3 has been it finished. I'm working on putting kind of my first round of edits in before I send it off over to the wonderful folks over at Crystal Lake to go ahead and tear it apart and really show me where all my mistakes are. Um,
Good things
so
editors do.
I know. I Hey, if it wasn't for editors or proofreaders, I know my works would not near it would they would be not nearly as entertaining for the readers. So I am very grateful for all the errors or mistakes they find, and um, yeah, that's next. I'm putting in those edits and working on it right now. I got about another 150 or so more pages of my own stuff to get in, and then I'll be sending that over. I'm also working on a standalone novel that I've been working on for about a month and a half or so now, um, and that's I'm really enjoying that and kind of blowing through it pretty good. And then after that, it'll be starting on Night Crew 4. So,
Well, there's lots to look forward to. And
oh yeah,
yeah, and okay, so we're going to wrap the episode up here. It was a pleasure chatting with you. We had a great talk about vampires.
I've always loved talking about vampires. It's a very fun topic.
It is. Okay, so that's it for this episode, and bye for now, everybody.